ever acted on your own foolish wisdom? Hopelessly lost, you continue driving down one road after another, refusing to ask for directions. Or you try something new in the kitchen, confident you really don't need a recipe. You muscle a repair when you should have just used your brain. We do all kinds of crazy things we laugh about later, don't we? But when a person or a family or a people group makes a habit of living this way, the consequences are no longer laughable. The book of Judges gives us a picture of the personal and social disaster that resulted when the Israelites chose to live by their own foolish wisdom. The end of the book of Joshua and the book of Judges tell us that the Israelites failed to drive the Canaanites from the land. As a result, the Israelites became increasingly Canaanized. The text suggests that the Israelites still acknowledged Yahweh, but they demoted him to a position of one God among many, and also worshiped the Baals, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. They became increasingly ignorant of the law of Moses. Twice the writer of Judges repeats, "Everyone did as they saw fit." Without divine intervention, Israel would have quickly lost her distinct identity. God disciplined his people by allowing foreign nations to oppress them. But when they cried out to him, he relented and sent a judge to deliver them. It was an act of compassion that also protected his plan to preserve Israel for his greater purposes. Of the 12 judges that the book describes, our previous lesson covered 5. Nothing negative is said about the first of these, Othniel, but thereafter the motives and behaviors of the main characters is increasingly suspect. According to Hebrews 11, Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah were men of faith. How should we understand the rub between this statement and their behavior in the book of Judges? Well, Moses was a sinner. King David was a sinner. Israel's judges also sinned. And in their case, the writer of Judges points to their immoral and foolish behavior as a reflection of the time in which they lived. While God used them mightily, they were deeply flawed and often acted out of their own foolish wisdom. Chapters 10 through 12 tell us of Jephthah and 5 minor judges. Chapter 10 begins with a very brief history of 2 judges, Tola and Jair. Then, like the accounts of the previous major judges, the story of Jephthah begins with the cycle of Israel's apostasy. The Israelites worshiped the gods of other nations, and as a result, the Lord sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. In Jephthah's story, the trouble with the Ammonites is recounted. The trouble with the Philistines is told in Samson's story. According to verses 10 through 16, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, confessed their sin, and got rid of their gods. Now, Jephthah, son of Gilead, was born to his father through a prostitute. His half-brothers deeply resented him. Yet Jephthah was a mighty warrior, and when the Ammonites gathered for war in Gilead, the Israelites realized they needed his assistance and begged him to be their commander. Jephthah used the opportunity to bargain for a position of permanent tribal leadership, and the bargain was sealed with a pledge. Jephthah's first action against the Ammonites was another diplomatic one. You see, Jephthah was a negotiator. When negotiations failed, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he marched his army out to fight the Ammonites. Now, in the Old Testament, the Spirit of the Lord came on a leader as an anointing for a specific task. Jephthah's victory over the Ammonites ended Israel's oppression by them, but the record of the victory is overshadowed by the story of his foolish vow. Jephthah vowed that after the battle he would offer the first thing to come out of his door, the door of his home, to greet him as a burnt sacrifice. Jephthah's predecessors hadn't sworn vows. This vow was simply unnecessary. Human sacrifice was an accepted practice among the religions whose gods Israel had been worshiping, but Jephthah should have known that the law of Moses forbade it. The Bible doesn't tell us what motivated Jephthah to make such a vow. At best, he was simply rash. Perhaps he had such a lifelong habit of bargaining and negotiating that he just rashly acted out of habit. But at worst, perhaps he was so Canaanized that he actually believed his vow would guarantee him success. In either case, he acted out of his own foolish wisdom. When Jephthah returned home, his virgin daughter ran out celebrating to greet him. As it turns out, she was Jephthah's only child. The keeping of his vow meant that he would have no posterity. Nevertheless, Jephthah honored it. One attempt to soften the story has been to alter Jephthah's wording so that instead of saying, "Whatever comes out of the door of my house will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering," he said, "will be the Lord's, or I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." This would have given him the option of devoting whatever came out of his door to service at Israel's sanctuary, a decision that would have meant a life of perpetual virginity for his daughter. However, a childless state would also have resulted from her death, and most scholars think that concluding she was sacrificed is the only way to understand the text without distorting it. In chapter 12, before telling us of 3 additional minor judges, the writer records a final episode involving Jephthah. We're told that the Ephraimites resented the fact that Jephthah hadn't called them up for battle, a complaint they'd also voiced to Gideon. When the land was first being settled, they displayed a complaining, resentful spirit against Joshua. Unlike Gideon and Joshua, who dissolved the Ephraimites' hostility with words of encouragement, Jephthah's response was defensive and only exacerbated the trouble. As a result, a civil war broke out, and 42,000 Ephraimites were killed. Although Hebrews 11:32 lists Jephthah as a man of faith, he's nevertheless remembered for his unnecessary bargain and the civil war that erupted after his failed negotiation. Instead of acting in accordance with the law of Moses, he did as he saw fit and acted in his own foolish wisdom. What can we learn from Jephthah? Well, bargaining with God is unnecessary and can end in disappointment. Bargaining with God is unnecessary and can end in disappointment. Do you consider yourself a successful negotiator? Have you occasionally bargained with God? It can take different forms, some very subtle. Maybe you've offered to serve him in exchange for physical healing, or to put a sin or bad habit to death in exchange for an answer to prayer, or to follow his leading in your life if he first proved his faithfulness in some specific way. Perhaps even subconsciously, you've considered your attendance here at Bible study as earning you points with God toward your salvation or his blessing. The Bible is abundantly clear that this kind of bargaining is futile. Nothing we do or offer God can ever merit his favor. An even subtler type of bargaining occurs when we expect God to answer prayers that are not in line with his will. Do we know the Word of God well enough to pray biblically? Jephthah either wasn't very familiar with it or ignored what the law of Moses said about human sacrifice. His prayer was answered, but as it turned out, Jephthah was deeply disappointed. Bargaining with God is just one way we sometimes act out of our own foolish wisdom. Well, while Jephthah sought to solve problems with strategic bargaining, Samson was a self-centered man who ruled by his passions. His story, once again, emphasizes God's faithfulness in preserving his entirely undeserving people. While most of the Danites, the tribe of Dan, migrated to the north, for some reason Samson's Danite family still lived near the Philistines. Samson is the last judge recorded in the book of Judges and is given the most attention. Perhaps it's because he most epitomizes the state of Israel as a whole in this period. As Israel went after foreign gods, Samson went after foreign women. Like Israel, Samson was abandoned by the Lord and didn't know it, was blinded and cried out to the Lord when oppressed, and was set apart for the Lord's service, but nevertheless lived among and intermarried with the enemy. Samson's best known, of course, for his unique physical strength. His strength was a living illustration of the emotional, spiritual, and civic strength that was available to God's people if only they'd turn to him with all their hearts. Unlike the other judges, Samson's story does not include any regional or large-scale battles. Instead, he acted more as a lone commando. The focus of his story is almost entirely on his personal struggles. Again and again, the Lord delivered him from situations he brought on himself. And in the process, the Lord brought judgment on the Philistines. Of great significance is the background of story here of Samson's birth and dedication as a Nazirite at the Lord's instruction, suggesting that his Nazirite vow is an important fact to keep in mind. A Nazirite vow was generally a temporary setting apart of oneself for the Lord. Those who took the vow were specifically restricted from cutting their hair, drinking anything fermented, or eating any product of the vine in contact with a dead body. However, Samson was set apart for the Lord as a Nazirite from birth, and as a result of the Lord's direct command to his parents. Since Samson is listed as a man of faith in Hebrews 11:32, we should probably assume that he learned the ways of the Lord from his parents and consented to comply with the vow. Unfortunately, the special separation for which he was intended stands in stark contrast to the life of unrestrained passion that he lived. According to chapter 14, Samson determined to marry a Philistine woman. En route to her hometown, Samson was attacked by a lion, which he tore apart with his bare hands. Later, he came by the carcass and found it filled with bees. Ignoring his Nazirite commitment to avoid dead bodies, he reached in and scooped out the honey. Samson's wedding feast became an occasion for the Lord's judgment on the Philistines. The word for feast in this context refers to a 7-day drinking bout at the home of the bride's parents, which was, again, something that was forbidden to a Nazirite. Samson's presentation of a riddle ended with Samson killing 30 Philistines, abandoning his new wife, and returning to live in the home of his parents. When Samson's anger subsided and he decided to make amends with his wife, he discovered that she'd been given to another man. A cycle of revenge ensued, climaxing when he struck down 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone, probably another violation of his Nazirite vow, using that jawbone. Chapter 16 tells of Samson's 2 lovers. First, he went to Gaza, one of the Philistine city-states, and visited a prostitute. Even though his actions were clearly outside God's will, God continued to work through him, and it became another occasion for Samson to use his unusual strength to demoralize the Philistines. Then Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah. After 3 unsuccessful attempts to discover the secret of Samson's strength, Samson finally told her that his strength was in his special relationship with God, of which his hair was a symbol. Leading up to this time, Samson had already failed to take his separation unto God seriously. Apparently, he took advantage of the Lord's grace one time too many, because with his full revelation to Delilah and the cutting of his hair, the Lord finally left Samson. Most tragically of all, according to verse 20, Samson did not even know that the Lord had left him. His unbridled passions finally led to his complete undoing. What happened to him was yet another picture to the Israelites, who, as one writer explains, had frittered away their high calling, lived by what was right in their own eyes, and provoked Yahweh to abandon them. The Philistines imprisoned Samson in Gaza and set him to grinding grain. During that time, his hair began to grow, a portent that the Lord would again use Samson. Sometime later, Samson killed a great number of Philistines in his final feat, also resulting in his own death. Although God used Samson even in his death was nevertheless a tragedy that he brought on himself by his ongoing immoral exploits. In some ways, he was a man of great faith, but he was also a symbol of his own culture. Too often, he did as he saw fit. Living according to our passions is perilous. Living according to our passions is perilous. The world tells us to do as we please, to live and let live, to follow our gut instincts. But to live according to our passions is to live out of our own foolish wisdom. Passion is a gift of God that we can use for great good or allow to destroy us. When harnessed, it can stir us to great acts of service. But when left unbridled, it becomes an idol that drives and consumes us. Passion drives us to worship, work productively, and be creative. However, we must be very careful even with these, for our passion can quickly turn and become the object of our worship, our work, and our creativity, a kind of idol. What a wonderful day it will be in heaven when our passions are no longer a potential snare, but only for pure enjoyment of God and all his gifts. For now, however, living according to them is perilous. Jephthah and Samson reflected the times and culture in which they lived. The 2 events described at the end of the book are a kind of addendum that further illustrates Israel's decline. Now, these events did not necessarily occur at the end of the period of the Judges. Chapter 20, verse 28 says that Phinehas, son of Eleazar, was ministering as high priest at this time, evidence that at least one of the stories actually occurred early in the period of the Judges. It seems they were put at the end of the book to make the point that as the Israelites continued doing what was right in their own eyes, everything kept going downhill. The first story is of a Danite woman who had her silver stolen and placed a curse on the thief. Her son Micah, who heard the curse and was himself the thief, confessed. Micah's mother consecrated the recovered silver to the Lord, but then used a portion of it to make an idol. Even if she intended the idol to represent Yahweh, it was a breach of the second commandment against making images. Micah's theft and his mother's response are the first of several illustrations of Israel's moral decay in the story. Micah made a shrine in his own home, we're told, a center of worship at which he could worship the household gods as he saw fit, even though the law of Moses forbade worship anywhere but at the one location of God's choosing. Micah then made an ephod, possibly to duplicate the garment that was only to be worn by Israel's high priest, and instituted his own son, who was not a descendant of Aaron, as his priest. Later, he took in another young man, a Levite, whose identity is otherwise kept from us to the end of the story, and installed him as one of his priests. The fact that he was a Levite probably encouraged Micah to hire him, although, as we later learn, he was not a descendant of Aaron. The phrase, "in those days, Israel had no king," is repeated twice in this story, indicating a lack of spiritual leadership and supporting the notion that everyone did as they saw fit. Micah worshiped as he saw fit, and no one in Israel was taking a role of spiritual leadership to keep that from happening. This story also serves the purpose of explaining how the Danites relocated to the north, although the land they'd been deeded by Joshua was in central Palestine. Judges 134 tells that they found it too difficult to remove the Amorites. As a result, they abandoned their inheritance and sought another. Some Danite spies who were seeking a new location for their tribe happened to come to Micah's house, where they encountered the young Levite acting as Micah's priest. Later, the Danite tribe stopped at Micah's home en route to the northern city of Laish, which they hoped to overtake and make their new home. They stole all of Micah's cultic items and took the Levite with them, who had served as Micah's priest. The Danites took the city of Laish, renamed it Dan, and set up their own center of worship, using Micah's idols and the young priest, Levite, as their priest. We now realize that the story is more than just about the sins of a single family. Rather, the sins of that family mirrored the Israelite culture at large. Micah stole from his mother, but then an entire tribe stole from Micah. Micah was an idolater who disregarded the lawful manner in which the Lord was to be worshipped. But he was not alone. These abuses were common in Israel, as the tribe of Dan proved. To emphasize the widespread nature of the corruption, the author, who's thus far left the identity of the young Levite concealed, unveils the shocking revelation that the young Levite who participated in this sordid affair was none other than Moses' own grandson, Jonathan. Finally, he emphasizes the disobedience of Moses' grandson and the entire tribe of Dan to the law of Moses with his final statement that the Danite worship center continued in use all the time the house of God was in Shiloh, the only place the law of Moses permitted Israel to worship. Now, the second illustration of Israel's decline in chapters 19 through 21 highlights both its moral decay and its political instability. The episode begins by reiterating, in those days, Israel had no king. This story also involves a Levite. The Levites were responsible to be teachers of the law of Moses, God's word. Nevertheless, this Levite took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, the first of several offenses. When she was unfaithful to him and returned to her parents' home in Bethlehem, he went there to reconcile with her. In what is later revealed as a twist of irony, on their return to the Levite's home in Ephraim, the Levite decided not to stop in Jebus, which is Jerusalem, because it was occupied by non-Israelites, but continued another 4 miles to Gibeah, a Benjamite town, which he apparently thought to be safer. In days where there were no inns, it was customary to offer hospitality to travelers, whether or not they were strangers. Hearing that a stranger was in town, the men of Gibeah insisted that the Levite be put out on the street for their sexual gratification. The Levite, doing what was right in his own eyes, cast his concubine out the door of the host's home in order to save himself. The story so closely resembles what occurred in Sodom just prior to its infamous destruction with fire and brimstone that one can hardly doubt that the author of Judges intended to draw the parallel. God's own people had become so immoral that they could actually be compared with the wicked Sodomites. The men of Benjamin raped and abused the Levite's concubine throughout the night. When he found her dead on the doorstep in the morning, the outraged, but not blameless, Levite then cut his concubine into 12 pieces and, seemingly for shock effect, sent them to each of the tribes of Israel. The Israelites agreed that their nation had sunk to a new low and something had to be done. Instead of showing loyalty to the law of the Lord and turning over the guilty Gibeonites, the tribe of Benjamin decided to defend their fellow Benjamites. The sins of one city became the sins of an entire tribe, and the sins of that tribe resulted in a national crisis. The Israelites from the north to the south launched a holy war against Gibeah, ultimately slaughtering all but 600 of the Benjamites. Now, the Israelites had pledged not to give their daughters in marriage to the remaining Benjamites, but after the Civil War, their pledge created a dilemma. Without marriage partners, the tribe of Benjamin would completely die out. The story ends by recounting the Israelites' twofold solution. These last two stories not only reveal the degree of moral and civil corruption and disunity that resulted from the Israelites doing as they saw fit, they also reveal that the national situation was simply a reflection of what was going on in the lives of individuals and families. The corruption in Micah's home spread to infect the entire tribe of Dan. And the single incident of lawlessness in Gibeah became a national crisis. What's our principle? As goes the home, so goes the nation. As goes the home, so goes the nation. It's always easier to blame our troubles on the influence of our culture than to examine our own hearts and homes, isn't it? We complain that our culture is immoral and compromising, but fail to address our own private thought lives. We complain that we live in a self-centered culture, but are really not very generous with our own money. We complain about rudeness in our society, but think nothing about our own occasional swearing or our expectation that everyone should excuse our irritability at home when we are tired or have had a bad day. In 2 Corinthians 7:1, Paul exhorts us to purify ourselves of everything that contaminates our body or spirit. What business is it of mine, he wrote, to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. We must take care of our own sin first, and then the sin of our families, and then the sin in our churches. 1 Peter 4:17 says, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the family of God." If we don't begin at home, self first, our sin will spread like a disease. You know that old saying, when I point my finger in accusation at someone else, 3 of my fingers will be pointing back at me. Judges is a heavy book with serious and amazingly relevant warnings. The Israelites lived by their own foolish wisdom, doing what was right in their own eyes. But are we much different? James 3:13 through 18 tells us that the wisdom that comes from heaven results in a harvest of righteousness. Are you seeing a great harvest of righteousness occurring in your family, in your city, in your country? If not, perhaps it's because too many of us who call ourselves Christians are still depending on our own foolish wisdom. Well, next week we'll move on to the delightful little book of Ruth.